On March 26, 2012, wind pushed grit across a farmhouse porch 12 miles outside Hutchinson, and a paper notice snapped against the doorframe like a loose tin panel. The document was not ambiguous. First Prairie Bank demanded $173,840.27, with 21 days to cure default on an operating note that had reset from 6.75% to 10.9% after 2 weak wheat years. Dustin Mercer stood in front of it in patched brown overalls with one knee mended twice, reading each line without hurry, then folding it once and slipping it into a seed invoice envelope he had already used 3 times. His 1999 Chevrolet C2500 sat in the drive with 312,000 miles on the odometer, a cracked windshield running corner to corner and rust lifting from both rear fenders in curled flakes. To passing traffic, he looked finished. By noon, that visual verdict had already spread through coffee counters and shop doors. Trent Halverson, regional sales manager for Plains Crown Equipment, drove out in a polished 1-ton pickup with dealership plates and a clean logo jacket that had never seen grease. He did not insult Dustin directly. He did something far more common in farm country during tight credit years. He offered rescue through leverage. A newer Dozer, $328,000 finance over 7 years. Monthly payment, $5,282, packaged with service intervals and predictable uptime. Trent framed it as modern risk management. Dustin listened beside the rusted Chevrolet, hands quiet at his sides, and gave him 11 words that sounded smaller than they were. If a machine is not paid for, it does not work for me. That line did not come from pride. It came from arithmetic learned the hard way over more than a decade, long before this notice was taped to his door. Dustin had started adult farm work with almost no margin and no inherited cushion. In 1998, at 20, he was renting 160 acres of wheat ground and 40 acres of mixed hay for a total cash rent of $13,600 per year, paid in 2 installments. His first major equipment package looked like a scrapyard inventory list. A 1974 International Harvester, 1066 for $8,900, a drill bought at consignment for $640, and a truck axle trailer he rebuilt for $1,120 in parts. He financed one purchase once, a used combine note for $27,500 at 8.4% over 5 years, believing scale would outrun interest. It did not. When bearings, feeder chain, and a transmission repair stacked in the same season, he paid $6,370 in emergency repairs and still owed principal. That year, he calculated that every harvested acre was carrying 3 invisible passengers: banker interest, deferred maintenance, and his own optimism. He sold the combine, absorbed the loss, and changed the framework permanently. He would rather run older, paid-off iron at lower daily capacity than newer financed iron at maximum stress. The prevailing consensus in his county favored borrowing to grow quickly because commodity years could look generous, and tax planning often rewarded equipment turnover. Dustin did not mock that view. He simply tracked what the payment schedule did during low-yield seasons. In his notebooks, one column always sat beside gross revenue, fixed obligations due regardless of rain, price, or diesel spikes. If that column climbed too high, he treated expansion as a liability, not ambition. His household budget reflected the same discipline. In 2004, when a better wheat year finally gave him breathing room, he did not buy a newer truck. He put $18,000 into principal reduction and kept driving the same pickup. Annual personal spending stayed narrow and explicit. Groceries, $4,980. Utilities, $2,340. Health insurance, $3,120. Clothing, $460. Church and community, giving $900. Fuel not tied to farm operations, $1,100. No vacation debt, no consumer installment plans. By 2009, he had a rule written on the inside cover of his ledger. Cash first, repair second, replace last. The core tension in Dustin's life was never effort. He worked enough. The tension was timing. Farming income arrives in waves, while bills arrive in calendar certainty. So he organized his operation around asymmetry. Every time a year produced unexpected cash, he bought down future risk instead of present comfort. In 2006, he prepaid seed and chemical discounts worth $2,140. In 2007, he purchased 2 used grain bins for $3,800 total and installed them with friends and borrowed welders, reducing basis pressure at harvest. In 2008, when diesel climbed and neighbors took short-term lines to bridge input purchases, he cut planted acres slightly, protected liquidity, and accepted lower gross revenue to avoid expensive bridge debt. That choice looked timid in spring and wise by winter. By the fall of 2011, Dustin's operation covered 410 wheat acres, plus custom odd jobs that most larger outfits ignored because margins looked too small. Terrace touch-ups, shelter belt trimming, culvert cleanup, abandoned fence extraction. He charged modestly and got paid promptly because he finished what he promised. Yet even with that reputation, 2 weak wheat years hurt. Yield variability and price timing compressed his working capital, and the variable operating note reset higher at exactly the wrong point in the cycle. This dynamic is what breaks careful people as often as reckless ones. Interest reprices faster than crops recover. Then came the legal acceleration. First Prairie Bank filed final intent to foreclose and scheduled sheriff review for April 18th, with legal fees and filing costs, pushing the payoff to $181,206.44. The number landed like iron. Not because Dustin had never seen 6 figures on paper, but because this 6-figure number came with a deadline measured in days, not seasons. 2 days later, on a cold morning drive back from a parts run, he passed a Concordia scrapyard and noticed a machine half sunk in gravel and volunteer weeds, a 1978 Caterpillar D6C marked for disposal at $11,800. The listing notes were blunt: cracked final drive housing, blown hydraulic line, seized idler. To most buyers, that combination meant hidden damage risk and salvage uncertainty. To Dustin, it meant a decomposed asset with undervalued work potential if repaired with disciplined parts sourcing. He spent 3 hours under it with a flashlight, checked serial markings, measured wear where he could, and made a decision that looked reckless to everyone except a person reading payment schedules line by line. Purchase price, $11,800. Salvage and used parts, $3,462.19. Hauling, $1,140. Total investment, $16,402.19. Trent's finance alternative cost $5,282 per month. Dustin's total outlay was less than 4 of those payments. For 6 nights, he worked in an unheated shop with a propane salamander, pushing warm air across concrete that never really lost its winter bite. He replaced lines, rebuilt what he could, and accepted cosmetic ugliness in exchange for mechanical function. When the engine finally caught and settled into a steady working cadence, He did not call anyone, and he did not celebrate. He sat in the cab for a minute, wrote one line in his ledger, then shut it down and made calls. He contacted 3 counties that same afternoon and offered cedar clearing, shelter belt removal, and pond reclamation at $165 per hour, cash on completion. No 90-day invoices, no receivables drift. He priced for immediate liquidity because the bank clock was still running. The pitch was simple: old Dozer, experienced operator, payment due when work is done. Within 48 hours, he had his first queue. Within a week, he had commitments stretching through early summer. People who saw the rusted truck and patched overalls kept reading him as a man on the edge, and visually, they were not wrong. He was on the edge. They were wrong about what he would do with it. The first call back came 19 minutes after Dustin left his 3rd voicemail. It was from a landowner near Arlington who had 62 acres of cedar choke and a windbreak that had not been touched in 15 years. The man asked what Dustin ran for equipment. Dustin said, "A Caterpillar, D6C, paid for." There was a pause long enough to hear papers move across a desk. Then the man asked, "What year?" Dustin told him, 1978. Another pause. "You can start tomorrow if it moves." At sunrise, he pulled into the property lane with the old Chevrolet rattling in low gear, trailer lights blinking unevenly. Paint on the Dozer faded to 2 colors of yellow and rust. His overalls were patched in 3 places now because one knee had torn again on a track guide the night before. Trent Halverson arrived 40 minutes later in a spotless 1-ton with chrome running boards and dealer decals, there to check on options for the same customer. Trent stepped out in a pressed work shirt and clean cap and looked at the D6C the way people look at a roof after hail. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You are billing $165 an hour with that? If that final drive fails on site, this job stalls. If this job stalls, you lose referrals. You can lock in guaranteed uptime today." The customer stood between them with a legal pad doing his own math. Trent's proposal for a newer finance machine, transport package included, came out to $5,282 monthly before fuel, insurance, and field support fees that would have pushed annual fixed obligations over $72,000. Dustin's bid was simple: $165 per billable hour, fuel surcharge only if diesel crossed $4.25, payment on completion each week, no lien filings, no financing paperwork, no usage minimums. Appearance made the first argument, arithmetic made the last one. By the first week of April, Dustin had 5 signed work orders, totaling 318 projected hours and $52,470 in gross billing if weather held. The same week, sheriff review remained on the calendar, and legal fees kept inching the bank number upward by line item. Before we go any further, if you want to see how one paid-off machine rewired an entire county's assumptions about leverage, subscribe now, because the crucial shift comes from numbers most people never bother to compare side by side. Dustin's no-debt sentence sounded stubborn in 2012, but it had been forged over 14 years of quieter decisions, many of them made when nobody was watching, and none of them dramatic at the time. In 1999, one season after he started renting ground, he met a retired operator named Clyde Morrow at an estate auction outside Haven. Clyde wore an old felt hat and carried a coffee can full of shear bolts and cotter pins because he said auctions sold optimism cheaper than parts stores sold hardware. Dustin followed him from lot to lot, listening. Clyde's first lesson was not mechanical. It was about payment timing. Your crop pays after harvest. Your note pays every month. That mismatch is where farms bleed out. He said it once and never repeated it. In 2001, Dustin ignored that warning and signed the used combine note already stamped in his history. $27,500 at 8.4%, 60 months, monthly payment $565.12. He told himself capacity would cover it. For 12 months, it almost did. Then came stacked repairs, feeder chain, elevator auger, bearings, and that transmission job. Repair invoices totaled $6,370 in one season, and he still mailed monthly checks on principal he had barely touched. Year-end ledger, combined value down, obligation unchanged, cash reserve down to $2,180. He was not reckless. He was ordinary, which is exactly what made the lesson stick. From 2002 through 2005, he rebuilt his structure around cash and schedule control. He took smaller custom jobs larger operators skipped. Terrace washout repairs at $58 an hour, culvert digs at flat rates between $320 and $900, post-pull work charge per lineal foot. None of it looked glamorous, all of it paid quickly. He split each payment into percentages that did not change with a mood. 50% operating reserve, 30% principal reduction, 10% repair fund, 10% household and church giving. If a month came in thin, percentages stayed the same. He adjusted spending, not rules. Clyde gave him one more break in 2003 when Dustin needed a serviceable blade and did not have cash on hand. Clyde sold him a used six-way blade for $1,200 and said, "Pay me when you can, no interest." Dustin paid him in 4 installments over 11 months. $300, $250, $350, $300. He wrote each payment on index cards and kept them in the ledger sleeve. Not because Clyde demanded records, because debt terms, even friendly ones, needed closure dates. When Clyde died in 2010 at 78, Dustin drove to the family home after the service and handed Clyde's daughter, Ruth, an envelope with $5,000. It was not owed on paper. It was owed in sequence. Ruth used $2,400 for funeral expenses and put $2,600 into a maintenance fund for Clyde's widow, who stayed on the place until she moved to assisted living in 2014. Ruth now runs a seed cleaning outfit near Yoder with 2 employees and no equipment debt, and she still keeps the index cards in her office drawer. The ledger years that followed were plain and relentless. 2002, net farm and side work income, $41,380. Principal reduction, $12,000. Repair reserve close, $4,960. 2003, gross $48,210. Bought used disc for $1,750 cash. End year, cash reserve, $9,340. 2004, gross $63,890 in a stronger wheat year. Applied $18,000 to note principal. Truck retained. 2005, custom work revenue, $21,440. Built grain handling upgrades with $2,980 in materials, no financing. 2006, prepaid seed and chemical, discount captured $2,140. No short-term line used. 2007, 2 used bins bought for $3,800 total. Installation labor exchanged with neighbors. No cash borrowing. 2008, planted acreage, trimmed to protect liquidity. Gross lower by $11,200, but 0 bridge debt entered. 2009, cash reserve crossed $30,000. Wrote doctrine line, cash first, Repair second, replace last. 2010, cleared remaining long-term equipment exposure. 0 secured equipment notes. 2011, yield pressure returned. Operating note reset risk emerged. Exposure concentrated in one variable instrument. None of these years looked like triumph. That is the point. Discipline rarely does in real time. If you are watching this and you have ever been told that growth automatically requires leverage, ask yourself one question and put it in the comments. Growth for whom and under whose timetable? Then come back to Dustin, because his answer was always in due dates, not slogans. Early in 2012, before the foreclosure filing accelerated, he had already been practicing the routine that later made the Dozer season viable. Every Saturday, he was at one auction, one salvage yard, or one fence row where older machinery sat half forgotten. He did not buy often. He priced relentlessly. If asking price plus worst-case repair estimate exceeded 60% of equivalent working value, he walked. He carried a notebook with 3 columns: acquisition cost, return to service cost, and break-even hours at likely billing rates. At a January consignment in Kingman County, a newer skid steer with financing terms drew 20 bidders and closed at $41,000 plus fees. Dustin passed. 20 minutes later, he bought an older hydraulic thumb attachment with surface rust for $1,050, spent $380 on hoses, and paired it with existing equipment for jobs that would otherwise have required rental attachments at $275 per day. That single purchase paid itself back in 16 billable hours. Maintenance was equally unsentimental: oil samples every 250 hours. Grease every day before first start. Track tension checks every 3rd day. If a bearing sounded wrong, he parked the machine and lost one afternoon rather than 1 week. His shop had no decorative signs and no financed tool chest. It had second-hand shelving, labeled bins, rebuilt pullers, and a whiteboard with 2 standing rules. Parts in stock beat panic buying, and preventive hours are cheaper than emergency miles. His personal spending stayed narrow enough to protect working choices. In 2012, annual household budget, before the crisis fully unfolded, was projected at $15,860. Groceries, $5,420. Utilities, $2,610. Health insurance, $3,480. Clothing, $520. Truck insurance and registration, $1,140. Church and direct neighbor help, $1,200. Miscellaneous, $1,490. Housing note, none. Consumer debt, none. Entertainment line, $0 formally budgeted, though he spent for pie and coffee at the co-op more than he admitted. By mid-April, the same visual cues that made people underestimate him kept doing their work. The cracked windshield suggested collapse. The patched overalls suggested last resort. The old Dozer suggested delay. Yet under that appearance sat a framework built to convert hours into cash, with minimal leakage to interest, fees, and depreciation schedules written by someone else. On the Monday before sheriff review, he finished his 3rd cedar clearing contract, collected $8,745 by check at the gate, deposited it that afternoon, and entered every line item that night, down to shop rags and hydraulic fluid. He did not celebrate there either. He updated the foreclosure envelope total, compared it against available liquidity plus contracted hours, and wrote the only sentence that mattered for the next phase: deficit is now finite. At dawn the next morning, he moved the number from a loose worksheet into the hardbound ledger, boxed it in red pencil, and wrote a second line beneath it: hours required at current rate, 1,098.22. That was the conversion he trusted. Not hope, not weather talk, not dealership assurances. Billable hours multiplied by collected cash. By the second week of May, the Dozer had logged 248.7 billable hours across cedar clearing, fence row recovery, and 2 pond cleanouts that had been postponed for years because nobody wanted to mobilize a larger financed machine for short rural jobs. At $165 per hour, May grossed $41,035.50. Diesel, field repairs, trailer tires, helper wages, and transport permits for that month totaled $15,882.14. Net equipment income for May, $25,153.36. He swept every payment into a separate foreclosure sub-account the same day each check cleared. June ran harder. He worked 276.3 billable hours in 30 days, including 4 days near Pretty Prairie, where windbreak roots had crossed old tile lines and needed careful extraction instead of brute force pushing. Gross billing was $45,589.50. Expenses rose with mileage and undercarriage wear to $16,904.22. Net for June, $28,685.28. Cumulative 2-month equipment net, $53,838.64. He still planted and managed his 410 wheat acres in the margins of those custom contracts. That was the non-trivial part most observers missed. The Dozer did not replace farming. It stabilized the farm's cash timing. Harvest came with modest recovery, rather than rescue. Yield averaged 43 bushels per acre, which put total production at 17,630 bushels. With an average cash price of $6.11, gross wheat revenue was $107,719.30. Input and handling costs were itemized without rounding. Seed $14,350. Fertilizer $18,220. Chemical $8,940. Fuel and drying $6,410. Crop insurance and hauling $5,579.30. Total crop costs $53,499.30. Net wheat contribution $54,220 exactly. July added 301.5 billable Dozer hours, partly because county work opened after road easement approvals that had been stuck on desks since spring. Gross, $49,747.50. Expenses, $18,633.70. Net, $31,113.80. August brought 289.2 hours, gross $47,718, expenses $16,227.11, net $31,490.89. September was 264.9 hours, gross $43,708.50, expenses $14,969.86, net $28,738.64. October closed with 207.0 hours before weather turned and daylight shortened. Gross $34,155, expenses $9,500.30, net $24,654.70. From May through October, the sequence was exact and auditable. 147 billable days, average 10.8 hours, Gross equipment revenue, $261,954. Direct cost, $92,117.33. Net equipment income, $169,836.67. Add wheat net of $54,220, and total operating net before tax reached $224,056.67. Subtract the foreclosure requirement of $181,206.44, and the remaining spread was $42,850.23. Deficit gone. Margin restored. Clock still running, but now on his terms. What made those numbers durable was not just revenue, it was leakage control. He bought hydraulic fluid by the pallet at summer pricing and saved $612 over piecemeal purchases. He rebuilt 2 rollers in his own shop for $740 in parts instead of replacing assemblies quoted at $3,180. He paid his part-time helper, Lane Whitaker, $19 per hour cash each Friday, with no delayed payroll obligations, and Lane knew exactly where his labor stood every week. At the end of October, the D6C had consumed wear items and maintenance totaling $11.42 per billable hour, while newer financed units in the county were often carrying fixed cost structures above $38 per hour before fuel. That spread was the underlying advantage. In Dustin's ledger, obligations were always tracked before gross, and across the counties that ordering choice was increasingly separating operators with recoverable strain from those facing irreversible debt timing. Dustin was not the only disciplined worker in Reno County. That is the part worth stating plainly. The people who were getting hurt were not foolish caricatures. They were skilled operators trapped by timing and debt structure during a volatile rate cycle. Evan Laird had built a strong custom harvest reputation over 15 years and leased 640 acres on top of his family ground to keep crews employed year-round. In 2010, he financed 2 late-model combines with a variable package that started at 4.9%. Remaining principal by 2012 was $286,000. When the rate reset to 11.2%, his monthly equipment payment stack jumped from $4,950 to $8,140. That was an extra $3,190 per month, $38,280 per year before fuel or labor. One dry spell and one delayed landlord payment later, he missed covenant tests on the lease package and lost the 640 acres. He did not lose them through laziness. He lost them through repriced obligations. Maria Bell and Tomas Bell ran a dairy that had once looked like the right scale for their county corridor. They carried $9,400 in monthly equipment payments on parlor and feed machinery, justified when milk checks were stronger and feed was steadier. Then feed inflation hit hard. Their purchased ration costs rose roughly 31% over 14 months. Their margin per hundredweight thinned, while fixed payments stayed rigid. They sold the dairy herd in stages to avoid a disorderly liquidation, took less than hoped on livestock, and filed Chapter 12 to preserve the homestead. Tomas started off-farm shift work in Wichita to keep health coverage active. Maria kept the books and managed a reduced livestock plan with determination and very little sleep. Jacek Novak had taken on a $400, $2,000 pivot and land package that penciled out at projected corn yields above 150 bushels per acre. Then drought cut him to 89 bushels on key fields, and the expected gross collapsed below debt service requirements. The loan, initially at 5.25%, moved toward 9.85% after reset triggers and tightened credit terms. Annual principal and interest burden crossed $49,000 while gross field margin underperformed by 5 figures. He sold machinery first, then gave up the package and took municipal grounds work in Concordia to rebuild from wage stability. He called it failure at the time. It was really survival. Dustin never used those outcomes as morality plays. On 2 Sundays in August, he brought meals to the Bells when sale prep consumed their evenings. He spent 1 full day helping Evan move remaining tools out of a leased shed before the lock change. He lent Jacek a trailer and did not charge him for it. No speeches, no verdicts, just practical help. By late September, the larger crisis was no longer local rumor. It was visible in posted rates, input sheets, and auction calendars. Variable operating notes across the region were repricing upward. Promotional equipment terms were narrowing. Diesel moved in a range that punished long hauls and idle time. Feed stayed elevated. Cash rents did not fall as quickly as commodity stress suggested they should. That combination crushed operators carrying high fixed monthly stacks. Trent kept making rounds through the same geography in a clean 1-ton pickup, still arguing that scale required leverage and that Dustin's scrap dozer was an expensive delay. He was not inventing a false paradigm. In stable years, his framework could work. The trade-offs changed under rate volatility, and that was the whole argument. Dustin had converted fixed risk into variable effort. Trent's customers had converted variable opportunity into fixed commitments. When conditions tightened, one model bent and the other snapped. 3 days passed after the October ledger close before the Reno County Conservation meeting, and that meeting became the first public moment where the numbers were spoken outside private notebooks. County staff tabulated completed work tied directly to Dustin's contracts. 1,920 acres of invasive cedar and overgrowth cleared, 23 farm ponds reopened, 41 miles of fence line restored to service. Landowners in the back row compared notes quietly and realized many of those projects had been deferred for years because financed fleets preferred larger continuous jobs with guaranteed minimums. The waiting list projected into spring. That night, back at his kitchen table, he translated one season's emergency tactic into a longer framework. He did not announce it. He wrote it. 2013. Buy 40 acres cash at $1,950 per acre. Total $78,000, no lien. 2014. Add second used dozer and $18,400 cash. Parts reserve funded at purchase. 2015. Bank 100% of custom work profit after tax reserve. 2016. Prepay seed and fertilizer to capture discounts. Avoid spring credit exposure. 2017. Purchase 80 acres from estate sale with cash. Close without financing delay. 0 interest, 0 liens, 0 renegotiation risk. The crisis had not ended for the county. Foreclosure notices were still appearing on doors, auctioneers were still setting dates. But by the first week of November, Dustin's arithmetic had moved from defensive to structural, and people who had laughed at patched overalls were now asking for his hourly availability and his maintenance schedule in the same breath. He gave them dates, wrote deposits into the ledger, and kept driving the rusted Chevrolet home under a sky that did not care who looked prosperous. The next Tuesday, with frost still on the shaded side of the courthouse steps, Dustin parked the 1999 Chevrolet in a row of cleaner trucks and unlatched a trailer carrying the same faded D6C that had looked like a mistake in April. He walked inside with a document envelope, mud on his boots, and 2 cashier checks cut that morning at First Prairie Bank's downtown branch. One for $150,000 and one for $31,000, $206.44. Total tendered, $181,206.44, matching the filed payoff to the cent. The lending officer, who had signed the foreclosure packet in spring, verified both instruments twice, then asked where the funds had originated. Dustin handed over 6 months of deposit summaries and contract stubs in chronological order. Equipment income deposits, $261,954 gross receipts, itemized by job and county. Wheat settlement records and elevator sheets tied to the $54,220 net crop contribution already posted in his tax work papers. Expense ledgers cross-referenced against checks and fuel slips. It took 23 minutes to reconcile because he had done the reconciliation before sunrise. By 10:17 that morning, the bank's counsel filed satisfaction on record and moved to dismiss the foreclosure petition. By 11:41, the judge signed the dismissal. No applause, no speech, just a stamped order and a house kept. Trent Halverson was standing in the hallway outside the clerk's office when Dustin came out. He had arrived with a folder of refreshed financing terms, shorter promotional window, higher floor rate, more conditions than he had offered in March. Trent tried once more, still in the language he trusted. You solved a cash event. That is not a growth plan. You can trade up now while demand is strong. Dustin nodded toward the trailer outside the window. That one paid this house off. Those 7 words traveled farther than any argument either man had made all year. Farmers heard them at parts counters, at Wednesday sale barns, at church parking lots after service. They heard the number attached to them, too. $181,206.44 paid in full before noon. And that detail mattered, because it turned a county rumor into an auditable fact. 3 days later, at a distressed land auction west of Plevna, that fact became structural. A neighboring 120 acres opened at $198,000. 2 finance bidders stayed active through $232,000, then paused while lenders reran debt service stress tests at revised assumptions. One dropped at $238,000. The other stopped at $242,000. Dustin bid $246,000 and signed cash terms. No financing contingency. Closing in 12 days. The room stayed quiet for a long second after the hammer fell, partly from surprise and partly because everyone understood what had just happened. He had not won with bravado. He had won with liquidity. That night, under the shop light, he entered the auction result beside the foreclosure line he had closed that morning and added a short note for himself. In volatile years, interest is often the line item that decides who keeps the deed. Through the remaining weeks of fall, the courthouse morning and the Plevna auction became reference points in every coffee shop argument about leverage. By December, the reveal had done what reveals always do in small farm economies. It rearranged who got doubted and who got asked for advice. Dustin did not become a lecturer. He kept his pattern: short answers, complete records, no theatrics. But he changed one policy in writing after Christmas. On a page titled Utility of Surplus, he divided post-expense cash into 4 channels: land acquisition reserve, equipment replacement reserve, tax reserve, and community retention reserve. That 4th channel became the generosity people would later talk about, though at first it looked modest, almost incidental. When the calendar turned, the policy moved from paper into transactions. The first use was Maria and Thomas Bell. Their dairy liquidation had left them with fragmented equipment, uneven pasture, and a debt workout that could have tipped the homestead if one more repair season went wrong. In January 2013, Dustin advanced $18,600 from the new reserve to cover fencing material, water line fixes, and a used squeeze chute so they could pivot from dairy to a smaller paid-off beef operation. Terms were handwritten on one page. 0%, first payment deferred 12 months, then $310 per month for 5 years, and one non-financial condition, that they submit a quarterly cash flow sheet, whether profit was up or down. Maria accepted because the condition was accountability, not pride. Tomas added weekend welding jobs in Wichita and met each payment date. Loan closed in month 53, 7 months early. By 2026, they were running 148 head on owned and rented grass with no equipment lines, and Maria's books were precise enough that 2 younger couples now asked her to teach budgeting classes each winter. Second was Evan Laird. After losing the 640 leased acres, he still had skill, reputation, and one exhausted service truck. What he did not have was working capital that did not punish him monthly. Dustin offered a different structure in March 2013. A $42,000 operating line from the Community Retention Reserve at 0% for 30 months, interest substituted with a labor exchange clause. Evan would provide 420 hours of harvest support over 3 seasons on Dustin's acres and custom contracts, valued at a pre-agreed $25 per hour credit, while making cash payments on the remainder. The blended payoff schedule reduced Evan's cash burden in weak months and kept him in field work, where he had comparative advantage. He completed 438 hours, paid the final cash balance in September 2015, and rebuilt enough credibility with landlords to lease 200 acres again under conservative terms. As of 2026, he remained current on every obligation and owned both of his combines outright, older models maintained meticulously, no variable debt. Third was Jacek Novak, whose transition to municipal grounds work stabilized his household, but left a psychological scar deeper than the financial one. Dustin did not offer him a farm rescue loan. He offered a bridge to debt freedom. In mid-2014, he purchased Jacek's remaining high-rate personal note from a local lender at discount. Face value, $27,400, acquired for $24,200 in cash because the note was classified elevated risk. He then rewrote it to Jacek at 0% over 48 months, $570.83 per month, fixed, no penalties, with 2 skipped payment options per year if family medical or housing expenses spiked. Jacek used both options once, extended by 60 days, and still completed payoff in 2018. He stayed in Concordia Municipal Management, moved to superintendent in 2021, and has carried no farm debt since the rewrite closed. What looked like charity from the outside was actually disciplined balance sheet design aimed at one outcome: keep capable people from being forced into distressed sales that destroyed long-term earning power. Dustin tracked every assistance file like he tracked machine hours, with origination date, terms, compliance notes, and closure date. If someone missed reporting requirements twice, he paused disbursements until records were current. Quiet kindness, hard edges. As those files matured, the operating side expanded on the same timeline, rather than in a separate chapter. The fund scaled because the underlying business scaled. In 2014, he bought the second used Dozer for $18,400 cash, exactly as written in his doctrine notes, then spent $6,980 returning it to reliable service. He assigned Lane Whitaker to that unit full-time after Lane completed operator certification, lifting total annual billable capacity without adding financed obligations. Lane's wages rose from $19 to $24 per hour over 3 years, then to a salary equivalent of $63,000, with health coverage by 2019. In 2022, Dustin sold Lane a 12% equity stake in the excavation business for $84,000. Seller financed at 0% over 7 years, contingent on no outside borrowing against company assets. Lane accepted, paid on schedule, and became minority partner without any bank lien entering the company. The deeper arithmetic that proves the philosophy is not one dramatic season. It is the compounding sequence after the crisis year, where each debt-free decision removes fragility from the next decision. His year-end ledgers, reviewed every December at the same kitchen table, read like this: 2013. Bought 40 acres cash at $1,950 per acre, $78,000 total. Custom work net, after direct costs and wages, $112,440. Wheat and hay net, $61,300. Year-end retained earnings after tax and living costs, $74,900. 2014, bought second used Dozer, acquisition plus repairs, $25,380 cash. Gross custom billing rose to $338,200 with 2 machines. Direct operating costs and wages, $178,460. Net custom income, $159,740. Land debt, 0. 2015. Banked 100% of custom profit after taxes per doctrine. Post-tax custom retention, $101,300. Farm net, $58,900. Community retention reserve reached $126,000 cumulative. 2016, prepaid seed and fertilizer, discounts plus timing savings, $9,870. Avoided spring operating line estimated at 7.1% short-term cost. Effective financing cost avoided, roughly $6,400 equivalent over cycle. 2017, estate sale purchase, 80 acres at $2,450 per acre, $196,000 cash. No closing delay. 2 finance bidders failed underwriting during extension window. 2018 through 2020 added 260 acres in 3 separate purchases totaling $1,014,000 cash, average $3,900 per acre on mixed quality tracts requiring improvement. Improvement costs $118,600 over 2 years, paid from operations. 2021 through 2023, rate volatility returned. Dustin made no variable rate commitments, no new equipment notes, and no collateralized operating debt. Custom division kept positive net each year, combined $487,000 after direct costs. 2024 through 2026. Land position reached 1,140 acres owned free and clear. Conservative valuation at $5,250 per acre on average quality, $5,985,000 gross land value. Equipment, inventory, and cash equivalents added $1,146,000. Outstanding liabilities, including taxes payable and routine accounts, $651,000. Documented net worth, $6,480,000. On a parallel track, and with the same record-keeping discipline, the generosity channel scaled and remained conditional by design. In 2019, Dustin formalized the Community Retention Reserve into a local revolving fund capitalized at $1.2 million. 0% for 5 years per loan, mandatory quarterly reporting, and a requirement that each recipient mentor one newer operator before final payoff. By 2026, 12 recipients had received equipment grants totaling $312,000, mostly for repaired used machinery rather than new purchases. 9 families used the separate Pay Me When You Can repair account to survive critical failures without predatory short-term financing. Default rate across all assistance programs, 0 principal loss, because terms were realistic and discipline was non-negotiable. The multiplier effect showed up in acreage and solvency, not sentiment. Those 12 grant recipients collectively controlled 3,460 acres by 2026, with estimated land and operating equity of $17.2 million at conservative local values. 4 had begun extending the same 0% short bridge terms to others under Dustin's documentation template, creating second-generation assistance without outside subsidy. Across those same years, the market-side counterpoint never disappeared. It simply evolved. Trent Halverson watched the shift from the opposite side of the same market. After losing multiple long-time new equipment accounts to used equipment demand, he left Plains Crown in 2021 and opened a brokerage in Cloud County focused on inspected second life machinery with transparent repair histories. At a farm credit seminar in 2024, he stated publicly that debt-free utilization had beaten his prior commission model by every metric that survives a bad year. He was not humiliated into that change. He was converted by repeated evidence. Ruth Morrow's seed cleaning business remained debt-free and profitable. Lane Whitaker remained partner operator and still kept Friday maintenance logs by hand. Maria and Thomas Bell stayed on their place with paid-off core equipment. Evan Laird kept his reduced acreage and his footing. Jacek Novak built a stable municipal career and closed his final rewritten note years earlier. First Prairie Bank had no pending foreclosure action on Dustin Mercer, no deficiency claim, and no unresolved filing attached to his home. In county talk, the thesis settled into one plain sentence people repeated without drama because they had watched the math themselves. The man who looked poorest built the strongest balance sheet, then used it to keep other people from losing theirs. What made that sentence endure was not rhetoric. It was follow-through measured over years. File by file, season by season, in a county where people notice whether promises survive a dry summer and a high-rate renewal. Maria and Thomas Bell became the first proof that Dustin's assistance model could protect dignity as well as balance sheets. Their quarterly sheets in 2013 looked fragile at first, with calf prices moving enough to unsettle cash flow and pasture recovery, slower than planned after dairy pressure. By the second quarter of 2014, their variable costs per head had dropped 18%. Because the repaired fencing allowed rotational grazing, they had not been able to run during the dairy unwind. Tomas kept welding shifts in Wichita through 2016, then cut back when beef revenue stabilized. Maria's books tracked every category to the dollar, including mineral, vet calls, and winter feed shrink. In 2018, they bought a used hay bine for $7,900 cash from retained earnings instead of financing newer equipment. In 2022, they cleared a small adjoining lease option, 46 acres, with annual rent prepaid each March. By the spring of 2026, their operations produced a net of $83,400 after direct costs and labor allocation, and their emergency reserve stood at $64,200. They were no longer surviving month to month. They were planning 3 years forward. Evan Laird's recovery was slower and more emotionally difficult because losing 640 leased acres had damaged his confidence as much as his books. The labor credit structure Dustin offered gave him a way back into field rhythm without crushing cash obligations. Evan's first season under that structure ended with only $6,800 left in unrestricted cash after family expenses, but he had not missed a payment and had not added new high-rate debt. In 2015, he negotiated a tighter but safer lease on 120 acres, then expanded to 200 acres the following cycle, only after showing 2 years of current obligations and positive working capital. He adopted Dustin's preventive maintenance routine almost line for line, including oil sample intervals and pre-harvest parts staging. Repair emergencies fell, uptime rose, and he began invoicing custom support jobs within 48 hours of completion, improving collection speed. By 2026, Evans' gross farm and harvest support revenue reached $312,000, with net operating income of $96,700. Both combines paid off, no variable note exposure, and a documented liquidity cushion equal to 7.4 months of fixed household and farm overhead. Jacek Novak's trajectory took a different form and proved the same principle. He did not return to row crop expansion, and nobody pressured him to. Debt freedom, in his case, meant choosing a stable municipal career and rebuilding household security outside farm acreage. The rewritten 0% note gave him predictability when he needed it most. After payoff in 2018, he continued the same monthly transfer amount into a savings account instead of ending the habit, accumulating $41,000 by 2024. He used $22,000 of that for a down payment on a modest home in Concordia and kept the rest as a reserve. As superintendent of municipal grounds by 2021, he brought in seasonal mowing contracts for local youth crews and insisted they run no financed equipment in their first 2 years. In 2026, he remained debt-free except for a conservative fixed-rate home loan with a payment ratio well below lending thresholds, and he had no unsecured balances. He called that outcome boring. In this story, boring is victory. Lane Whitaker's path mattered because it showed how Dustin's model could create ownership without leverage. Lane moved from hourly helper to certified operator, then to minority partner under 0% seller financing, tied to strict covenants against borrowing against company assets. That structure forced patience and taught capital discipline in real time. In 2023, Lane and Dustin jointly declined a financed fleet offer that would have added 2 newer machines and over $11,000 in monthly fixed payments. Instead, they bought one older low-hour unit at auction for $42,600 cash and spent $8,240 bringing it to standard. Utilization stayed high, margins stayed resilient, and Lane's equity value rose because the company balance sheet stayed clean. As of October 2026, Lane had paid $48,000 of his $84,000 equity obligation, remained current, and supervised a 3-person crew with no payroll arrears. If you are learning something from this, pass it forward with one click because these outcomes are built on arithmetic that rarely gets taught before people sign their first major note. The multiplier effect became visible by 2020 and undeniable by 2026. The revolving fund at $1.2 million did not sit idle. It recycled principal as recipients repaid, then redeployed into new 0% 5-year agreements with reporting discipline. Total loan originations since formalization reached $2,940,000 because the same dollars turned multiple times, Equipment grants of $312,000 to 12 operators reduced outside borrowing by an estimated $487,000 when compared with financed alternatives available at the time of each award. The 9-family repair account prevented distressed sales in 7 documented cases where short-term predatory credit had been the only other option. Across all supported households, aggregate controlled acreage reached 3,460, and combined estimated equity held at approximately $17.2 million under conservative valuation assumptions already used in Dustin's own net worth model. That is how one paid-off Dozer season cascaded into a regional solvency effect. Trent Halverson's resolution was equally concrete, and it carried no theatrical collapse. His old model worked when rates were low, terms were promotional, and utilization assumptions held. Those conditions stopped holding. After repeated order cancellations and a clear shift toward inspected used inventory, he left Plains Crown in 2021 and built a brokerage in Cloud County around transparent repair histories, utilization logs, and payment risk analysis that included downside rate scenarios. Farmers who once heard leverage-first pitches now received side-by-side schedules. Finance total cost over term versus cash purchase, plus expected maintenance. Trent's income became less explosive but more stable. In 2024, at that Farm Credit seminar, he publicly stated that his earlier approach underweighted repricing risk and overestimated uptime certainty on heavily financed fleets. He did not frame Dustin as an enemy or himself as a villain. He framed both as products of different assumptions tested by the same market. By 2026, his brokerage remained profitable, smaller than his prior territory role, and better aligned with what local operators could survive in bad years. By late harvest 2026, the roll call was complete and verifiable in ordinary places: tax files, county deeds, maintenance logs, and bank statements that no longer carried foreclosure language for the Mercer place. Dustin still wore faded caps and patched work clothes. The 1999 Chevrolet C2500 still ran, odometer at 389,000 miles, windshield replaced once for safety, but body rust unchanged on both rear fenders. The original 1978 Caterpillar, D6C, still worked limited hours, now used for shorter reclamation jobs and training runs for younger operators learning track discipline. The second Dozer handled heavier seasonal volume. Both units were owned outright. No liens. First Prairie Bank had closed the foreclosure chapter years earlier and maintained Dustin as a conventional deposit and treasury customer with no delinquent history. Ruth Morrow continued operating her seed cleaning business near Yoder with 2 employees and debt-free equipment. Lane Whitaker remained minority partner and field supervisor, current on his equity note. Maria and Tomas Bell remained on their land with a paid-off beef operation and a documented reserve policy. Evan Laird continued farming reduced acreage and stayed current across all obligations. Jacek Novak remained in Concordia Municipal Management, debt risk controlled and predictable. Clyde Morrow's widow had passed peacefully in assisted living in 2019, and Ruth had used the remaining maintenance fund exactly as intended before closing that account. No unresolved files, no pending legal actions, no open rivalry requiring one more confrontation. Dustin's own books in 2026 reflected what people had once mistaken for scarcity. 1,140 acres owned free and clear, net worth documented at $6.48 million on conservative values, custom and excavation operations still debt-free, and community assistance still conditional, still monitored, still active. He did not convert any of that into lifestyle display. He converted it into optionality for himself and stability for others. If you want more stories built on this kind of real arithmetic, subscribe now. Then leave a comment with your answer to one precise question. What fixed monthly payment in your own operation would you cut first to gain resilience before the next rate swing? Share this with one person you care about who looks successful from the road but is quietly carrying too much payment stress, because the lesson here is plain and earned the hard way in Kansas wind. Appearance is a costume, debt is a clock, and disciplined cash flow is what keeps a farmhouse door free of notices year after year. 2 mornings later, before sunup had lifted the frost off the east fence, Dustin set a folding table in the machine shed and laid out 12 manila folders in a straight line, each stamped with the same words in black marker. Revolving fund, quarterly review. The D6C sat 20 feet away with its blade lowered. Paint still faded, track pads dark with dried clay from the prior week. Coffee steamed from a dented percolator on a propane burner. By 7:00, Maria and Tomas Bell were there first, carrying a 3-ring binder thick enough to split if dropped. Maria opened to their October through December sheet and slid it across to Dustin and Lane. Net for the quarter, $21,310. Feed cost per head down to $1.89 per day. Emergency reserve $68,400. No late payables. Tomas set a cashier check on top of the binder, then tapped it once with one finger. This one is not for debt. Debt is done. This one is for the grant match requirement. $5,000 toward the next 2 applicants. Dustin looked at the check, then at Maria's handwritten ledger columns, then nodded. You met the condition. Who are you mentoring this year? Maria answered without pause. 2 couples, both under 100 head, both cash budgets only. First meeting is next Thursday. Evan arrived next with windburned cheeks and a folder held together by a rubber band. His reporting was still less elegant than Maria's, but every line reconciled. Gross receipts for the quarter were $79,420. Direct operating costs were $53,110. Household draw remained capped at $4,000 per month. His liquidity line showed 8.1 months of fixed overhead covered. He had brought photos of his combine teardown because mentoring requirements now included preventive maintenance evidence. Lane flipped through the photos, stopped on one showing tagged bearings in labeled bins, and grinned. You finally started labeling. Evan shrugged. Cheaper than guessing. Jacek Novak came in last, straight from Concordia in a municipal jacket, and placed a slim folder on the table, with the precision of a man who had practiced getting paperwork right after once getting it wrong. His debt freedom statement from the rewritten note closure remained clipped to the inside cover. Next to it, he had attached his city pay stubs, savings transfers, and the youth crew budget he ran each summer. $18,600 payroll, $3,240 fuel, and blades, $1,980 maintenance, all equipment owned outright by year 2 under the program rule Dustin had pushed him to adopt. I brought one question, Jacek said. A mower deck spindle on Unit 3 is wearing fast. Replacement is $740. We can finance a whole package, but I am not doing that. Can the repair account float it for 60 days while city reimbursement clears? Dustin took the request form, checked the account ledger, and wrote an approval amount of $740 at 0%, due on reimbursement receipt. Approved. File your receipt same day. By the first Monday of December 2026, those review mornings had become ordinary in the way durable systems always do. Ordinary and measurable. The revolving fund principal still stood at $1.2 million. Cumulative originations had passed $2,940,000 because repaid dollars recycled. Equipment grants remained $312,000 across 12 recipients. Default losses remained $0. Across recipient households, controlled acreage held at 3,460, and combined equity remained near $17.2 million using the same conservative land assumptions Dustin used on his own statement. One season of Dozer cash in 2012 had become a local credit architecture that did not depend on promotional rates or optimistic projections. That afternoon, after the folders were refiled, Dustin opened a shallow drawer in his office desk and pulled out the seed invoice envelope from March 2012, edges soft from handling, foreclosure notice still folded once inside. Lane watched him hold it for a second, then return it to the drawer beside Clyde Morrow's index cards, each one marked paid. Nothing theatrical, just records with closure dates. 2 weeks later, at a farm credit seminar in Cloud County, Trent Halverson stood at a lectern in front of 83 operators and projected 2 cost schedules on a screen. One was his old model from Plains Crown years, new machine at $328,000 finance 7 years, payment stack $5,282 per month before fuel and service add-ons. The other was a used equipment utilization model. Purchase and repair total $16,402.19. Variable costs tied to actual hours. No fixed line exposure. He did not hide which one had once earned him better commissions. "I sold urgency," he said, voice even. "Urgency works until rates reprice and utilization drops. Then urgency becomes foreclosure math." Someone in the third row asked if he was saying financing was always wrong. Trent shook his head. "No, I'm saying untested assumptions are expensive. Run downside scenarios. Run idle scenarios. Run bad weather and late payment scenarios. If the plan only survives in good years, it is not a plan." After the session, he stepped off the stage and found Dustin near the back wall by the coffee urn, still in a faded cap, still looking like he had come to pick up parts rather than sit through a seminar. Trent held out a single-page brochure for his brokerage, inspected used inventory with repair histories attached. "You were right about one thing I missed," Trent said. "Paid for equipment buys time. Time buys choices." Dustin looked at the brochure, folded it once, and put it in his coat pocket. "You changed the model." Trent exhaled, half nod, half tired laugh. "The old model changed me first." No rivalry remained after that conversation. No unfinished argument waiting for one final scene. On a gray day in late January 2027, County Recorder data confirmed what everyone already knew from tax statements and deeds. Dustin Mercer held title to 1,140 acres, no liens filed. First Prairie Bank's public docket showed no pending foreclosure actions tied to his home or operations. His balance sheet, reviewed with his accountant and signed, still read $6,480,000 net worth under conservative valuations, land $5,985,000, equipment and inventory and cash equivalents $1,146,000, liabilities including taxes payable, and routine accounts $651,000. His truck still started hard in cold weather, odometer beyond 389,000, rust still lifting at the rear fenders. Appearance still told the wrong story to strangers. Inside the county, people knew better because every name in this story had landed somewhere verifiable. Maria and Tomas Bell remained on their place with paid-off core equipment, reserve policy active, mentoring 2 younger couples each winter. Evan Laird farmed 200 leased acres and his home ground, both combines owned outright, obligations current. Jacek Novak stayed in municipal grounds management in Concordia. Household debt risk controlled, youth crews trained on cash-only equipment discipline. Lane Whitaker remained minority partner. Equity payments current, shop logs still handwritten every Friday before he went home. Ruth Morrow kept her seed-cleaning business debt free near Yoder and closed her mother's maintenance account exactly as intended after her passing in 2019. Trent Halverson's Cloud County brokerage remained profitable, smaller than his old territory role, aligned with used inventory and transparent repair histories. Near sundown that same day, Dustin walked from the shed to the farmhouse porch, carrying nothing but a grease rag and a mailbox key. Wind moved through dry grass the way it had in March 2012. The door was plain, paint worn at hand height, no paper snapped against the frame, no legal notice, just a quiet hinge and a warm light in the kitchen window. He paused long enough to look back at the Dozer parked by the fence, then stepped inside and shut the door on a house that was his, a farm that was his, and a philosophy proven the only way that matters in farm country, through numbers that held when weather and rates did not. If you want more stories grounded in that kind of arithmetic, subscribe. Then comment with one fixed payment you would remove first if you had to build resilience before spring. Share this with one operator who looks fine from the road, but is carrying too much silent risk, because Kansas already ran the experiment. The poorest-looking man in the county built the strongest balance sheet, and then used it so fewer doors wore foreclosure paper again.